allihopa. Hej och jättevälkomna hit till del 2 av Dr. Ravis föreläsningar här i Uppsala. Jag heter Rebecka Jonsson och jag pluggar på Uppsala universitet på Policies kandidatprogram. Jag är också med i Agape Uppsala som är en kristen studentorganisation som är med och anordnar det här eventet och det som var igår tillsammans med Credo. Vi har människor från olika delar av världen här idag, så därför kommer vi ta resten av den här kvällen på engelska.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Barrett Harkins. I am the National Campus Director for Agape Sweden Student Ministry. I've been here for 5 years. I am, as you might understand from my accent, American. But I've come to love this country. As a part of that, it's fun for me. Dr. Zacharias has meant so much to me and his speaking team over the years. It's kind of fun for me. I feel like I'm sharing a little bit of myself with you. Not that I own Dr. Zacharias or anything. It's very exciting for us. We're live streaming tonight on the internet, so a big hello to all of you watching on the internet. You know, in order to pull off a big event like this, with so much advertisement, so much planning, there are a lot of people to thank. In particular, I'd like to thank people with Agape, students and staff who've worked so tirelessly, specifically Jenny Knox, who is our local leader here. She's done an incredible job organizing, as well as with Credo. Stefan Gustafsson, Gunilla Becks, without their help, we could not have pulled this off. Their insights and their thoughts on these matters have really shaped this evening. You know, we have a lot of people from a lot of different lands here. We've had people from Germany, Italy, Holland, oh goodness, the UK, and many other places. And it's just a reflection of Dr. Zacharias and his work and how meaningful it is to so many lives. As Christian organizations with Agape, Sverige, and Credo, as working with students and as being Christian organizations, we believe that life has questions. And that those questions are best answered in the person of Jesus Christ. And it is our hope that in tonight, as we discuss some of the things that we do, as Michael Ramsden, who will come up first, and Dr. Zacharias after him, talk about why I am a Christian, that it might bring up some questions in your own life as to why am I myself a Christian, or what do I even think about Christianity and the claims of Christ? Because to think is to exercise the brain that we have, and that is a good thing. As I said, tonight, here's how it will work. Michael Ramsden will come up and speak for 15, 20 minutes or so, enlighten us on a few thoughts of his own. And then that will follow, Dr. Zacharias will immediately follow him, which after Dr. Zacharias will have a question and answer period. There are 2 microphones in the back. And if you were here last night, you stand up, ask a question, but you can also SMS a question to the following number. So if you have a pen and paper, you can write it down. Feel free to SMS. I can't promise that we'll be able to answer every question that is SMS, but we'll try our best. The number is 0738966752. Again, that number is 0738966752. You're most welcome to SMS at any point during the evening. The only addition tonight that we'll have, as opposed to last night, is perhaps that you find that you want to ask a question, but you don't know how to formulate that into English. You are most welcome. We'll have a translator who can take, if you want to ask that in Swedish. He also speaks Arabic, so if you happen to know Arabic, you can ask it in Arabic. Give him a little bit of a fun challenge. But go ahead and you can ask that question in the language of your preference, and if it needs translation, we can do so. But please ask it into the microphone so that the speakers can hear it. And finally, this evening, underneath your chair, as you go out, as the evening ends, we would ask that you take some time to fill out a response card that we've put underneath your seat. It really helps us get connected with you. And then as you leave, you can put it in the boxes that are in the back. Also, as you leave, if you happen to be a student, stop by the table out there with the Credo and Agape staff and students that are there. Talk with them. Get to know those organizations as well. Unfortunately, tonight, we have to leave almost immediately after this, and so Dr. Zacharias will not be able to stick around and greet people. We have to go immediately to the airport. So we apologize for this in advance, but we ask that you would respect that because he travels almost 250 days a year. and it's very hard to keep a good schedule if you're always having to stop. Thank you for that in advance. It's at this point that I would like to invite up Michael Ramsden, and one of the things I love about Michael is his humor. He's incredibly humorous. I have enjoyed listening to him over the years, but in that humor, oftentimes humor can bring forth a lot of truth. And so I hope that we will listen to Michael tonight. So join with me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you. Well, it's a privilege for me to be here. I've enjoyed very much my time here in this city. I've been to Sweden several times, and actually I'll be back here again next week visiting my brother and his Swedish wife in Stockholm, where no doubt I will be eating far too much Swedish food and leave much heavier than when I arrived. It's this evening, what I'm going to try and do is just outline for you the processes and some of the questions that I wrestled with before I myself became a Christian. I spent most of my childhood living in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, and then in Saudi Arabia. And as a result of that, while I was growing up, I heard very little about the Christian faith. I certainly didn't really know many Christians. I wasn't exposed to the church or to the Bible. But I did have a lot of questions. Now, when my parents moved eventually from there to a country called Cyprus, and I moved to go and live with them. And as an older teenager, I found myself living in this country with newfound freedoms which previously I hadn't really had available to me, and a string of questions which still were unanswered. Now, I grew up in a culture, both in the countries I lived in the Middle East and in Cyprus, that had a very liberal approach to how copyright law was interpreted. What that basically meant was I could get video of major films on video to watch in my home, sometimes before they'd had their world premiere in whatever country they'd originally been made in. And given the fact that there wasn't a huge amount of other things to do, I also grew up watching a huge amount of film. And those things really made a deep impression on me. Now, at that time in my life, I know I was wrestling with a series of questions. They felt unusual for me, but obviously they're not unusual. We all face them. Who am I? A question of identity. Why am I here? A question of meaning and purpose. Where am I going? A question of destiny. And as I looked out, I could see that through the privilege of being part of the kind of family that I was part of, which was very successful and very influential, that it seemed that increasing amount of success and influence wasn't going to satisfactorily answer all of those questions for me. Now, at about the same time, I also began to copy what I saw was being done in the movies. I think I was trying to, at that point, as a teenager, become the kind of person I felt that if I achieved and became that person, finally I would have found the answers to the questions which I had. So I started copying what I saw in films because I liked what I saw. One of my heroes was a man by the name of James Bond. James Bond had a silver cigarette case. I, too, had a silver cigarette case. I used to smoke filterless French cigarettes because I could remove it from the cigarette case, flick it in the air. It didn't matter which end I caught. You could always light the other end. Although I'm not proud of any of this, another one of my heroes was and certainly for me, someone who I felt was more inspirational almost than anyone else I met, was a man by the name of Clint Eastwood. Some of you are here too young to know who he is. The rest of you will know to whom I refer. I can remember I used to watch his cowboy films, and I loved those films. I can remember not only with my silver cigarette case, I can also remember I would take the bit on a box of matches, you know that little bit that you strike a match against in order to light it? I would remove that and stick it on the bottom of my shoe. So having put a cigarette into my mouth, I could take a match and light it on my shoe like I'd seen done in the movies, in the Western movies. That whole idea was actually inspired in me through an interview that someone once had with Clint Eastwood. He was being interviewed and someone said to him, "Why does everyone think you're so cool?" And he looked at them and took a little cigar out of his top pocket, put it on the edge of a table so it was overhanging, flicked it so it started spinning in the air. While it was spinning in the air, produced a match from his back pocket, struck it under the table, caught the cigar in his mouth, lit it, inhaled very deeply, blew one very big smoke ring, 3 little smoke rings through the middle of the big smoke ring, and said, "I don't know." And all of this was appealing to me, trying to appropriate an image to myself to become the person who I wanted to be. Now, it was during that time that for the first time in my life, I met some Christians for whom being a Christian had made a fundamental difference in their life. Up until that point, if you asked me about almost any world religion, my feeling was that most of them were hypocrites. They claimed to believe one thing, they often lived another. There seemed to be no real evidence at the very center of their life to back up what they were talking about. But I met a group of Christians and I could tell there was something very different about them. Now, I was slightly suspicious of them initially. I felt about Christians at the time as I felt about communists. I'd been raised in a Middle Eastern country. We didn't really like communism, and I felt the same about Christians and communists, that they had nothing, but they wanted to share it with you. But as I came to know them better, I became intrigued and approached them with my brother and asked if they would consider setting up a discussion group where we could talk about these kinds of questions. And we set it up, we brought our friends to it, that group grew. After about 6 months or so of asking questions, we went away. The people running this group shared with me the fact that they were trying to organize a camp to take us away to, but the government was blocking us using the camp. And I can remember saying, well, why is that happening? They're saying, well, we're not allowed to use the camp because they don't recognize us here in this particular country. And so I said, well, look, I can probably help with the government. What do you need? And they said, we need permission from the Minister for Interior and from the Chief of Police. I went back home that evening and spoke with my mother. I said, do you know who the Chief of Police is? She said, of course I do. When I was 12 years old, he invited me to go out with him on a date, and your Uncle George knocked out his 2 front teeth and said if he ever spoke to me again, he would kill him. I said, is there any way you could ring him? My mother rang him. She said, do you remember who I am? He said, I remember exactly who you are. She said, I have a favor, and to which he said, for you, I will do anything. So that was the Chief of Police sorted out. One phone call later to the Minister for Interior, and we went away on this camp. And on the second day of that camp, I became a Christian. So I actually helped plan, organize, and execute my own conversion, which is unusual in some circles. Now, what had happened for me when I arrived at that camp was I realized I had come to the conclusion that the Christian faith was true and real. But I also realized at the same time that I didn't want it to be true or real. Now, let me just explain both how I came to the conclusion and why I was now wrestling with that final question. Now, when I started out in this group, I think I was profoundly indifferent to the Christian faith in particular. I was just interested in, are there answers to the kinds of questions which I'm asking, and if so, where can I find those answers? Now, the first thing that came as a massive surprise to me was to realize that Jesus Christ actually existed. If you would ask me at that point, before I joined, what I thought about him, I would have said, well, there's no evidence that such a person ever existed because I'd never seen any. Now, the simple fact was I'd never looked for any. And I was surprised and shocked at the kind of evidence that there was that Jesus Christ was indeed a historical figure. To deny his historical existence is highly risky. A colleague of mine, Professor John Lennox, who's a professor at the University of Oxford, had a debate a couple of years ago with Professor Richard Dawkins in the Science Museum of the University of Oxford, sitting underneath the skeleton of a T-Rex. And they were both sat under its head debating God's existence, and some people in the audience were speculating about what would happen if the head of the T-Rex fell off, which one it should land on. Now, the way the debate started was remarkable because they'd had a debate 6 months earlier. And so one of the opening questions asked by Professor Lennox to Professor Dawkins was, Professor Dawkins, you intimate in your book that there are no solid grounds to believe that Jesus Christ was a historical figure. And then he said, there are several people in the audience today who are senior members of the professors at this university in the history faculty who would probably disagree with that conclusion. Can you share with me on what basis you claim that there is no evidence? And his response was, actually, yes, fine, he did exist. I'm willing to admit it. To try to deny his historical existence is incredible. Now, I wish I had time to run through all of this with you. I don't. There is a website hosted by a professor of ancient history called Dr. John Dixon. I'd recommend that you maybe Google it if you're interested in more. But just to run through, you have Tacitus, a Roman historian writing very early, who talks about Christus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And then he talks about the fact that a pernicious superstition arose around the figure of Jesus Christ, that people came to believe in him, and that this Christianity was like a disease, he said, and it has spread and has even ended up in Rome, where, quote, all things shameful and horrible end up. Suetonius, writing during the reign of Nero, talks about the new and mischievous belief that spread up around this person of Jesus Christ. Thallus, writing around AD 50, talks about the crucifixion. Pliny the Younger, writing after that, talks about that Christians meet on a fixed day of the week and they sing to Christ as if Jesus were a god. Lucian talks about the fact that not only was he crucified, but that questions were asked about the nature of the validity of his birth in terms of whether he was a legitimate child or not, that he taught, that it was rumored he said he did miracles, that he was crucified, and that Christians now sing to this Christ as though they are singing to God. And Ignatius then talks about the fact that he was of the line of David and born of Mary and crucified under Pontius Pilate, and it's alleged that he's raised from the dead. Now, it is true that we do not get a lot of information from these sources. From the 45 non-biblical sources that attest to Christ, which are 19 early creedal sources, 4 archaeological ones, 17 non-Christian ones, and 5 non-New Testament Christian sources, we learn very little about Jesus. That I'm willing to admit. All we learn about him is the place, time, and nature of his birth, about his mother, his father, the fact that he was famed as a teacher. It was rumored he was a miracle worker and that people called him the Messiah or the Christ. We read about the time and the manner of his execution, that there was an eclipse at the time, that it was reported and alleged that he rose from the dead, and that he was worshipped as a god. Now, that's all that we can learn if we go to the non-biblical sources. Just that rough, flesh it out more, then we're going to have to then start digging into some other sources. But that's for me where it started, a shock and a realization that we were talking about a historical figure and a historical person. Now, the next thing that then happened is we began talking about the resurrection. And I can remember being challenged to look into it. I was wanting to do a law degree at the time. That was what my first degree was in law. And I thought, this is intriguing, and let me look into it. I spent 3 weeks at that time, which isn't a lot of time looking into it. And I remember coming to the end of that time. During that time, I read a debate between Professor Habermas and Professor Anthony Flew, Flew being one of the most famous philosophers of history and an atheist at the time, who debated the resurrection, called Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? And I remember reading through that debate, chasing up all of the sources, looking at the evidence, and came to a group of Christians 3 weeks later as a non-Christian and gave them a presentation on why Jesus Christ definitely rose from the dead. Now, this caused some confusion. At the end of my presentation, they said, "Are you a Christian then?" I said, "No." And they weren't sure what to do with that, because the fact that Jesus rose from the dead was an interesting fact, but I didn't see why it should change my life or why it should change anything about my life. The question was, did this happen? And the evidence seemed to point very strongly towards the fact that it did. If you're interested in looking to this, depending on how you approach it, if you like mathematics, then why not read Professor, now his name's just gone out of my head, Jesus Who Rose from the Dead, who uses Bayes' mathematical theorem to talk about it, a professor at Oxford University. Professor Richard Swinburne, who wrote a book on Jesus Christ and the resurrection, published by Oxford University Press, looks into the evidence and then tries to weigh how likely is this, and concludes with that with a very high degree of probability we can conclude that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. A modern professor, Professor Habermas, who debated with Flew, has published widely on this area. But I came to the conclusion that that had happened. And so now, all of this time later, I now find myself away, sitting on a mountain called Mount Olympus. And I come and I realize that I have concluded several months ago that I now believe that the central historical claims of the Christian faith are true. Jesus Christ was a historical figure, that this resurrection had took place, and the other things I'd been told, like Jesus Christ never claimed to be God, I also had concluded were simply not true. However, I didn't want it to be true. The reason I didn't want it to be true was I felt very fulfilled as an individual. I came from a loving family who cared for me and met all of my needs. I had the privilege of a wonderful education, even a privileged upbringing, being able to see money and power in action. And if you were to ask me to rate my life out of 10, I think I would have given myself an 8. I was often top of my class in every subject that I was in. I enjoyed sport. I was captain of the tennis team, captain of the swimming team. I was also captain of the chess team, captain of the debating team. I founded and set up the first environmental society at the school I was in to deal with the issues, to deal with the environment. You know, I felt certainly exceptionally good looking and also remarkably humble. As far as I could see, I had everything going for me. And becoming a Christian, therefore, felt like a backward step. If I was enjoying life 8 out of 10, becoming a Christian felt like dropping to 2 out of 10. And I'll never forget that Saturday night, sitting on that mountain, looking over a deep valley, chain smoking my way through 40 cigarettes. That will tell you how long I was wrestling with the final decision. And my question was this: will I ignore the claims of the Christian faith which I believe are true and real because I think they will make me less happy? Okay. Or will I embrace the Christian faith and become a Christian and sacrifice my only chance for happiness and fulfillment on this life on the altar of truth? That is how it felt to me. I came down from the mountaintop. I found 5 of my closest friends who were there with me. And I got them all together, and I looked at them, and I said, tonight, I'm going to become a Christian. From now on, I won't be enjoying life. I went, and I found the people who were organizing it. And I said, I need to talk to you now. And said, I can't hold out any longer. I'm convinced that this is both true and real. And I want to become a Christian. I remember them praying with me. And the thing that changed me the most was the utter transformation I then had in my life. A couple of days later, I was with someone, a model who I had been unsuccessfully trying to endear myself to, can I put it like that carefully? And she was one of the reasons why I thought I may be enjoying life less as a Christian before my conversion. And as I met and came into a room with her for the first time since my conversion, I can remember having decided that I would tell no one what had happened in me for a while. And she simply looked at me and she said, you've changed. There's something different about you. What happened? I remember saying, I'm not sure I can properly explain it to you. And she said, try. I said, I became a Christian yesterday. And she looked at me and she said, what on earth does that mean? I said, and I remember saying to her, all I can tell you is that I know I am not the person that I once was, and my life has been completely changed. She leant forward, crossed her legs, and said, would you like to sleep with me? I remember looking back and saying, if you had asked me 30 hours ago, the answer to the question would have been yes. But today the answer is no. I'm being surprised at the response. The reason why I became a Christian was because of a conclusion that it was true, that it was real, and that the promise Jesus Christ made that he could change any human heart, no matter how far from him, was real if we turned to him, was right. And that is the process that happened for me as I became a Christian. Thank you for listening to me. Dr. Zacharias now will come and fill in the blanks.
I really don't like to follow Michael Ramsden, because I don't know if anybody has asked me the questions they've asked him. Some of them are tough, but he made the right decisions. I've known Michael now for nearly 20 years, and our friendship goes back. It's a deep friendship. He joined our team about 17 years ago. Michael did his doctoral work at Sheffield in international monetary law, and he was actually going into a professorship. When I met him, talked to him, and invited him to join our team of apologists, he walked away that night saying, "No way." But he went to bed that night, and God did the work that I could not do. He woke up in the morning and felt very remorseful that he had said no. And the rest is history. We've traveled around a lot now, and whenever things get dull, I phone him, and he's able to make you laugh even when there's nothing funny about it. It's just the way he tells you those stories. But Michael's become a dear friend, and his lovely wife, Anne, she just needs 2 words in their marital relationship. It's, "Oh, Michael. Oh, Michael." Every now and then he gets off onto something, and she has to just be an utter chagrin over what he's just said. Let me tell you something about him when he was talking about how impressed he was with his own humility. You've heard about the fellow who said, "I want to speak to you on humility, but I'll save it for a larger audience." That would be Michael's kind of line. Can you hear me clearly? Am I coming through loud and clear? Because when you talk to us from the microphone, we don't often hear it as clearly. Now, I want to tell you a bit of a lighthearted story and then go into my talk on why I am a Christian. Michael has given it a personal narrative, how he personally encountered the claims of Christ, what it was he struggled with, how it is he came to make that decision. I will talk to you more on general terms and what I believe is the person, the work of Christ, and why I see in him the true answer to life in his person, in his work, and in his teaching. But the humorous story is told of this Indian guy who was, along with many others, going in for an exam. And I don't know how it is in your country, but in India, oftentimes the question papers are the same. And we find wonderful ways of meeting up with people who have already taken the exam and finding a way of getting the questions. We do this brilliantly all the time in India. We are skilled at it. It never helped me because the friends I made never had the right answers, so it didn't help me very much. But this particular guy is waiting for a fellow to come out of the examination hall, and he looks at him and said, "What were the questions? What were the questions?" And the fellow said to him, "Look, we were told by the interviewers we were not allowed to share the questions because the same questions are being asked of everybody." But he had been asked 3 questions. The first question he was asked was, when did India get its independence? And this fellow said, he was a kind of a philosopher type of guy, you know, he said, "Well, many efforts went on a long while before, all kinds of activities and discussions and debates and meetings and so on. And finally, India got it in 1947. So the second question was, who is the father of the nation? And he said, you know, it's not fair to just pin the privilege on one person. So many people put in their efforts in all of this, so I don't think I'm going to give credit to just one person. And the third question was, is corruption India's biggest problem? And he said, you know, the Prime Minister's appointed a committee and a study is being made, and when those results come, and then I can confidently answer the question right now. So those were the questions, those were the answers. This boy now is asking him, what are the questions? He said, I can't tell you the questions. He said, all right, what were the answers then? Just tell me what the answers were. So he gives them the sequence of answers. He said, they didn't tell you not to give me the answers. They just told you not to give the questions. So he repeated the answers. So this boy walks into the hall and he's meeting 3 guys across the table. And one of the professors looks at him and he says, you know, your form is not complete. What is your date of birth? He said, actually, many activities took place a long while before. A lot of discussions, a lot of conversations, and a lot of getting close to each other and all of that. And I was finally born in 1947. They looked at him and said, what's the name of your father? He said, you know, it's not fair to just like one person to name as my father. Many people participated in this whole thing and not just one. So one of the professors looked at him and said, are you crazy or what? He said, actually, the Prime Minister's appointed a committee to study this question. You know, oftentimes we mismatch the answer to the question. This happens particularly in matters of such enormous importance. I don't know how many times in the early days have I ever encountered somebody who was asked a question about God or about Christianity or what it was. No matter what question you asked, the answer ended up being the same thing. They were not really listening to the question. And we as a team are very careful to make one particular thought function in our minds when we are answering the questioner. I've told my entire team, you are not just answering a question, you are answering a questioner. If you answer a question and you not answer the questioner, you can end up with some highfalutin theory and the person will walk away totally unconvinced with the answer. And so the danger is when Michael and I or any one of us attempts to answer this question, it is hard to pinpoint what is it that you struggle with. What is it that keeps you between a barrier and the answer that makes you think, I cannot accept the Christian answer to the deep questions of my heart. And I hope if your question is not answered with any specificity, that you will take the liberty of talking to the organizers or even get online and write to us. We will make it a point to get back to you. Yesterday, one of the questions that was asked was, how can Christianity be exclusive? How can you just claim exclusivity? The fact of the matter is, I'm not sure if people are aware that every worldview is intrinsically exclusive. Hinduism is exclusionary. Islam claims exclusivity. Naturalism excludes the supernatural or the transcendental in any fashion. Wherever the answers come into metaphysics or ethics or whatever, the naturalist who lives on the basis of the pure sciences will say, this is not in my realm of believability and does not mean the empirical test of truth for me. So the fact of the matter is, exclusivity is at the core of every major worldview. Even Baha'ism, which claims an all-inclusionary posture where all religions are equally true, even Baha'ism will exclude the exclusivists. So exclusivism is intrinsic to the worldview. Where do we sometimes run into problems with this question of the Christian faith? We run into problems actually long before you get to the person of Christ. And the question is, I don't know if God really exists. Many of you might be saying here, Ravi, if I were convinced in my heart that there is an infinite, moral, personal, first cause, I would look more carefully into the claims of Christ, but I'm not quite sure I really do. And if I were to say to them, why don't you believe in the existence of God? One of the most common answers is that science has done away with that believability of it all. If you look at Stephen Hawking's latest book, where he includes the statement that, gravity is ultimately the explanation for it all, he made some cardinal philosophical blunders in that book. So serious were one or two of those blunders that the theologians did not need to come to counter him. The philosophy department at Cambridge took him on. Because on page 5 of his book, he made this astounding statement that philosophy is dead. Imagine making a statement like that in one of the most sophisticated universities with the Department of Philosophy as one of its fine points. I had the privilege of studying there under some of its philosophers years ago. And so what I say to you is, when he made that statement, the chairman of the philosophy department responded, and I quote, he said, maybe it's about time we realize that the oracular Professor Hawking has not kept up with philosophy and theology rather than us not keeping up with his discipline. That was it. Somehow I have a feeling the publisher maybe pushed him into making a statement like that. I don't know. But to make an irresponsible statement from a man who was such a clear thinker was certainly not in keeping with the kind of intellect Mr. Hawking actually has. Now, David Berlinski is a skeptic and a scientist living in Paris. He takes issues with people like Richard Dawkins and the other. Now, David Berlinski has not got an axe to grind about any religion. He's a self-avowed agnostic. He says, I really don't know if I believe in the person of God. He says, but what I do know is that the scientists who argue so vociferously against the existence of God are getting out of the bounds of science. And so in responding to Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, he wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion. He says, has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. This is Berlinski. And what he's really saying is, keep the lines clear. Don't so blur the lines here. And he would give the same kind of caution to religious people. And it was Galileo who long time ago made the comment, he said, the Bible is a book on how to get to heaven, not a book about how the heavens go. It's about how to go to heaven, not about how the heavens go. It was fascinating in Cambridge to have a lecture going on next door by Don Cupid. I studied under Cupid, a one-time Anglican priest turned atheist. And straight from there, I would go and take lectures in quantum with Professor John Polkinghorne, who was a skeptic turned Christian and lecturing in the sciences. If you haven't read Polkinghorne's book called One World, A Latecomer to Christ, fascinating how intellectuals can turn their beliefs from one to another. And I've come to the conclusion it's really not got much to do with intellectualism ultimately. It's got to do with how you bridge the head to the heart. The ramifications of the head to the heart. And that is the longest journey in life. So said Archbishop Donald Cogan years ago. So let me take a little bit of your time to take the head and the heart argument about why I see Jesus Christ to be who he claimed to be. You will wrestle with these thoughts, you will think about them, and I pray you will just think about them very seriously. The first is this: he gives me the most accurate description of the thoughts and intents of my own heart and the thoughts and intents of the human mind. How we think, why we think the way we do, how corrupt our thinking can get, how we can even justify the most unjustifiable and rationalize the most irrational. D.L. Moody said, if a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you want to change him so you send him to university, at the end of his education he will steal the whole railway track. Some of the most sophisticated issues today in vileness are carried on by those with the greatest amount of power. I've seen it. I'll never forget in my 20s how my life was changing before my own eyes. I was a young undergraduate student in Toronto, and I was invited to go to Vietnam and speak. I didn't know why I was invited. I don't know what they had in mind, but somebody very influential there asked me if I would be willing to travel through the military bases, speak to many of the armed forces there, not just the Americans, but the Australians, the Koreans, and so on and so forth. So here I was in my mid-20s, single, all of a sudden exposed to the horrors of warfare. If you have never seen close at hand what all can go on in warfare, you've not got a glimpse of the cruelty to which the human heart can ultimately go. And that's why many of them come back with post-traumatic stress disorder, the haunting memories of it all. My father-in-law was a navigator in the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War. He died when he was in his mid-80s, he was a Canadian, my wife's from Canada. Till the day he passed away, the nightmares that he would have, screaming sometimes in the middle of the night, of all the horrific memories of what had happened in that senseless and bloodletting war that we call the Second World War. And if you go back to the first, even more brutal. I'll never forget leaving Vietnam at the age of 25 with what I'd seen and some of the pictures that I have never taken out after the first 2 weeks and kept it packed. It is still in the basement of our home because I hated seeing what I saw. Then in the 1980s, during the Cold War, I was invited to speak in Poland. And my Polish host asked me if I would like to see Auschwitz. I told him, I'd been to concentration camps. He said, no, Ravi, this is not a concentration camp. This used to be a death camp. I'd been to Buchenwald and Dachau and so on. He said, this is a death camp. I wasn't prepared for what I was going to see then again. So my life again, now being reshaped in my middle years. 12,000 obliterated every day in Auschwitz alone. Think about it. Think about it. And you walk away from there and say, how? How did the most sophisticated nation in its time get herded into this mentality by a handful of men and demagogues to get them to do what they did? If you saw the pictures of the children on the wall, castrated boys, twins, standing, if you'd strummed your finger on their ribs, you would have heard the sound of it. They were so emaciated. And I think the story that captured it all for me was when I read the article by Peter Malkin, who was the Mossad chief intelligence person who was given the charge to track down Adolf Eichmann in the swamps of Argentina. And Peter Malkin somehow tracked him down, and from a distance with their high-tech equipment every day would watch what was happening here. Eichmann was working at a Mercedes-Benz factory. It's told in the book, The House on Garibaldi Street. And he would be watched unknown to him. He would carry his briefcase, bony, straight-shouldered, come up to the door, unlock it, and before he did, he would always look over his shoulder to see if anybody was watching. Hadn't the faintest clue he was being watched the whole time. Gets off the bus one day, and as he's getting down, 3 of these guys come up close to him. One of them jabs an injection and knocks him out. Puts him in a car. He is dressed up as an El Al pilot and taken back onto a flight and brought back to Jerusalem. I went to the Yad Vashem Museum to look at the documents when I was writing my book, my little booklet, Jesus Talks to Hitler. And you see page after page after page of interrogation of Eichmann. Thousands of pages. Here's what happened. Peter Malkin was given the responsibility to bring him back, not to interrogate him. As he's about to disembark from the train and turn Eichmann over to the authorities, he couldn't resist one question. He went into the compartment where Eichmann had been, his mark on his arm and all of that, SS. And he said, Mr. Eichmann, I just have one question for you. Please help me with this. Every night I watched you come home. You opened your door and a little boy would jump into your arms and you would embrace him. Who's that? He said, it's my son. He said, how old is he? Eichmann gave the age. He said, Mr. Eichmann, I had a cousin, I had a nephew, exactly the same age as your boy. You killed him. Why? And Eichmann is reclining, Malkin is sitting on a chair, asking the question. No expression on his face. He turns to Peter Malkin and says, my son wasn't Jewish. And with that statement, Malcolm left those confines and went away and sobbed uncontrollably, unable to explain why his race was so hated by somebody. What is all that about? You see, the Bible says that you and I are also capable of hate, of malice, of lust, of greed, of pride. You're capable of it. I'm capable of it. If it is somehow not guarded and garrisoned and channeled in the right direction, what do we call that? We may call it wrong thinking, we may call it perverted thinking, we may call it racial prejudice, we may call it anything that we choose to. Jesus calls it sin. We don't like the term. I know I'm interviewed by media many, many times, and if I want to end the interview and they ask you, what's the reason for all of this? The moment I use the word sin, it's like, our work is done. We've got this boy in our camp now. This is the one we want to play out front. Not realizing that their very motives and their very prevarications prove the point I just made. A woman once stood up at Johns Hopkins when I was speaking on this. They had asked me to speak on what does it mean to be human. Francis Collins and I were the token Christians on it. Everybody else came from all kinds of other worldviews. And a woman stood up and said to me, I don't agree with you that we have wickedness and evil in our... And the louder she shouted, the more she was proving the opposite of what she was asserting. Mad at me as anything. It reminded me of the time in my undergraduate days. We were going through that strange time. I've never liked it. My wife has never liked it. Where you arrive in a place and then somehow they find a way to tell two of you to sit down together and tell each other something you don't like about the other person or something you do like. I don't know where we came up with all this kind of stuff. But this was in the 70s. So we come out of the class and there's a friend of mine. I can still picture him. He came out of there angry, stomping. I said, what's the matter with you, Sheil? He said, well, do you know what he said he didn't like about me? I said, what? And he's stomping his way to the mailboxes. How dare he tell me anything like that? Of course I know how to take criticism. And I'm walking beside him. I said, don't shout too loudly or you'll prove it to everybody else too that you don't. Here's what I want to say to you. People who don't like the word sin and argue against it, prove the point. That at the core of sin is pride and a violation of purpose. One of the well-known professors from Johns Hopkins was a man by the name of Hobart Maurer. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins, 4 years instructor at Yale, 8 years professor at Harvard, became the president of the American Psychological Association, committed suicide when he was 75. He wrote an article called Sin, the Lesser of Two Evils. Here's what he said. For decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But at length, we've discovered to be free from sin and to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful is to court the danger also of becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves now find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? And then he quotes the Anna Russell folk song. At 3, I had a feeling of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it follows naturally, I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. Viktor Frankl, who should be familiar in these parts, who spent 3 terms in Auschwitz, in one of his books made this comment. You know, if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we will corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we will feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing more than the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared. Listen to this carefully, please. The gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry of defense or other in Berlin, rather at the desks and lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Stunning statement. Stunning statement. This didn't happen in the defense ministry. This happened in the academy, where nihilism was fed and caused one group of people to believe in their superiority over all others. How easy it is to corrupt the human heart. How easy it is. And I say to you today, show me a description anywhere that is so accurately portraying your heart and mine. You know, I want you to know this. I'm an itinerant man. I travel over 200 days a year for the last few years, and you get really homesick. I know what they offer out there. I know what is used to seduce you out there. You see it all the time, but I have talked to more and more and more who've yielded to the seduction, who've ultimately destroyed themselves. One professional baseball player said to me when we finished, I have more money now than I ever wanted, but I have less things of any value in my life now because of the way I went with the money that I had. The heart. The day you realize Jesus' description is accurate is a triumphant day in your life. Why? Because he also, secondly, provides an answer to that malady. What Michael talked about. You know, some of my family may be listening in to as I'm talking. They will tell you, I was the loser of the five of us. My sister till this very day says, I don't know why Dad had it in for you and why he was so merciless with you. I've never figured it out. I've told the story in my book, Walking from East to West, when my dad looked me in the eye one day and said, you're going to be the biggest cause of embarrassment to this family. It drives me onto that edge, to that point of wanting to take my own life. So dramatic was my conversion after that, that when my father died in his 60s, rather suddenly, I was living in Niagara Falls, Ontario. He was living in Toronto, where all my other brothers and sisters were living. I was 75 miles away. He phones me. He says, son, will you come and drive me to the hospital? The others are 10 minutes away. I was about 90 minutes away. I said, I'll do it, Dad. All he wanted was to have those minutes alone with me. As I walked him into that surgery by his side, he said, I just want you to know, I will never be able to thank God enough for what he did in your life. The change he brought in you that ultimately led to their own conversion, my brothers and sisters, and all, same thing happened. Here's what I want to say to you. See, the Christian faith is the faith that is based on the grace of God, the forgiveness of your sin, and the redemption that he brings in your heart and mind, the transformation with new hungers. I'll give you this thought and move very quickly to my final one and give you a chance for questions. Because of the way we speak all over the place, every now and then I'm called in to speak at prisons. It's not a happy feeling. And the bloodiest prison in America used to be in a place in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, 20 miles away from nowhere. And I arrived there, 5,300 prisoners. 85% of them are on life without parole. 45 of them on death row. And you walk past that death row guy and you just look at these guys in that tiny little barred area, an open toilet and a small cot and a little table and a Bible on every table. You know what happened? There was a warden by the name of Burl Kane, wide-hipped guy. He comes in and he tells the governor, I will take hold of this prison and change it. Let me do it my way. The governor says, because you know, when you used to check into that prison, I was told by people working there was blood on the ceilings, blood on the carpet, blood on the walls. You were given a knife when you checked in there to protect yourself. It's in prison. He said, I'll take care of it. Let me do it my way. He starts Bible studies, starts a seminary, starts daily chapel, and the gangs of thugs have been converted to gangs of pastors. It has become the safest prison in America. He told me, bring the prettiest girl and let her walk in front of this. You will not hear a whistle or a catcall or profanity. Neither inmate nor staff are allowed to use bad language out here. So they asked me to speak. And at the end of it, one of the guys comes down who led in the worship. And I said to him, are you a prisoner here? He said, yeah. I said, life without parole? He said, yeah. I said, can I ask you a question? You're young. You're never going to get out of here. He said, that's right. I said, how do you feel? He said, Mrs. Zacharias, if you knew the man I was and why I am here, and what happened to me after I came here since I found Christ, for the first time in life, I am free. He said, pray for my family who think they are free, but they are really in chains. So I'm walking past this death row room by room, and a big 6'6" guy by the name of George Morris. He's a chaplain to one of the basketball and football teams at the University of Virginia. Big, burly guy. If he tells you to do anything, you do it. So he's standing next to me, and he puts his hand on my shoulder looking into these cells. He says, you know, bro, if we had these Bibles in our high schools, we wouldn't need as many of them out here. The redemption, the transformation, the change, nobody can deny that in history. The change that Christ, even Lecky, the skeptic from France, said, no one in history has had that transforming effect as the person of Christ. Napoleon said the same thing. The redemption, revalue. So, the human condition, the provision for my malady. Thirdly, let me just say this, the meaning that he brings to your life and mine. I know that sounds like a lot. I've given whole talks on it. I don't have the time to unpack it, except to tell you, he combines that sense of enchantment, undergirded by truth, with the capacity for love and the security for life itself. Those four components bring meaning: enchantment or wonder, truth, love, and security. That's what really brings meaning in life, from a child to old age. But the final thing I want to say to you is this: the hope that he gives. So let me summarize what I mean by the person of Christ and the hope that he gives. I see four components here at least. Number one, it's this. Do you realize that it takes 1,500 years of historic books, books on teaching, books on inspiration, books on wisdom, all of those, 1,500 years, 40 authors, 66 books, all pointing to one person? That could not have happened by accident. It's incredible when 1.5 millennium points to that one. Number two, the series of prophecies that are utterly incredible, with such specifics that it would be easy to falsify it if it were not so. What is that? Take Daniel chapter 8, written in the late 500s before Christ. And Daniel is in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Here's what he says in Nebuchadnezzar's dream when he has it. Head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. A stone cut out of no man's hand shatters this. That's the dream Nebuchadnezzar has. Daniel explains it to him. You are the head of gold. And he goes on to explain the dream. But then he goes so far in detail in chapter 8. He says a he-goat from the west will emerge strong, chewing up everybody in his path. But when he is young, he will suddenly be cut off. He will suddenly be cut off. And when that he-goat is cut off, his kingdom will be divided into 4. Those 4 will blend into 2. Those 2 will emerge into 1. Late 500s before Christ, Daniel chapter 8. Alexander the Great comes on the scene, suddenly cut off, kingdom divided between his 4 generals. They come into the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires. That emerges into the Roman Empire, ultimately smashed by a stone cut out of no man's hand as the church emerged and the Christian message took hold of that part of the world. 500 years before. The specifics of that prophecy, just in 1 chapter. Okay? So you see the length of time, the specificity. And the third is this. You know, in the East, embellishment is very common. Very common. You talk big to make it sound big. Jesus was asked a question to which he gave the most amazing answer. When will you return? If Jesus were a fake, you know what he would have said? I know, but I'm not going to tell you. I know, but I'm not going to tell you. Or given some date which would have made it unfalsifiable. He made an amazing response when he said, of that hour knows no man, not even the Son of Man, referring to himself. I don't know that hour. In his kenosis, in his emptying, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation and took upon himself the form of a servant. Just imagine how shocked the disciples were with that statement. I don't know it. I forfeited that right. How beautifully transparent, not displaying a demagogic bent whatsoever. If you ask a Muslim, why do you deny the cross? They'll generally give you one of 2 reasons. One of it, they say, is that the Quran says he didn't die on the cross, which is the only historically claimed description that denies the cross. Roman historians affirmed it, Greek historians affirmed it, Jewish historians affirmed it, pagan historians affirmed it. The expression of his death on the cross, so extraordinarily sustained. But the second thing they would say is, how can God be bullied at the hands of mankind? So mercilessly. But he said, for this very cause did I come into this world. And the fourth thing I say to you is this. Isn't it amazing who was transformed by him? Terrorist Saul of Tarsus, who was pursuing him to kill all of his followers, and a dramatic conversion. I remember when I was in Syria a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the chief of intelligence called me to his office, and I got used to that every time I went. Baklavas and all of that sitting in front of you, you know. Cigarette smoke in the air, and the generals with all of their medals. And they would always look at me and say, Mr. Zacharias, we know who you are. Thank you. And then he said this, you are welcome. We want you here, but don't ever get involved in politics. I said, you have my guarantee. You are welcome here. And then as I was getting up, he said, we like to have you here because, you know, This is where it all began. I said, not quite, a few miles down the road, but I know what you mean. He's talking about the Damascus Road and the conversion of Saul of Tarsus and the street called Straight, which still is there today in Damascus. Saul to Paul. Number 2, doubting Thomas to martyr Thomas in India. Number 3, James the brother who had to face the resurrection in order to be converted himself. Peter, who was terrified when he was going to the cross, transformed. All 12 of his disciples died a violent death. 11 out of 12 of them at somebody else's hand. Judas at his own hand because of the remorse he ultimately felt of what he'd done. For a joke. For a joke. They knew Christ had risen from the dead, and they were willing to pay their own lives. Let me read this for you, and then I will close. 2 things. Lazarus, G.K. Chesterton puts these words into his mouth. After one moment I bowed my head, and the whole world turned over and came upright. I walked again where the old road shone white. The sages have 100 maps to give that trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the dust and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, because my name is Lazarus and I live. After one moment I bowed my head and the whole world turned over and came upright. I walked again alone where the old road shone white. The sages have 100 maps to give that trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the dust and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, because my name is Lazarus and I live. Michael and I were in Cyprus together, and we visited the place where Lazarus supposedly became the bishop, and in that particular church, the grave there bears his name, and here's what it says: Lazarus, Bishop of Larnaca, twice dead, friend of Jesus. What a friend who calls you from the dead, calls you from the grave. This is the closing thing. When I was in Vietnam, I was handed a poem written by a U.S. Marine. Here's what he wrote. Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool, I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole, I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand. Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad, God, I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid, since I know you're near. The signal. Well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots. I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying. I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God. Goodbye. Strange now since I met you. I'm not afraid to die. The description of the human condition, the provision for your malady, the cohesiveness of meaning that he gives, and the hope in the resurrection from the dead. That's why I'm a Christian, and that's only a part of it. God bless you. Thank you for giving me your undivided attention.
As we did last night, we have time for one brief question. Please do keep it brief so that we can answer as many questions as possible. And if you would prefer to ask your question in Swedish, Edvard here will be translating for us. I have quite a few SMS questions, and they're, as I've been looking over them as you've been speaking, Dr. Zacharias, they're quite good, so I hope you guys brought your A game.
I don't know if there's anybody who was not here last night. This is Nabil Qureshi. He is the newest member of our team. Pretty good-looking guy, but more than that, he's got a strong brain inside his head. Nabil and Michelle make their home in Atlanta now. Nabil is a medical doctor by training, he's an MD, but he's picked up 2 master's degrees in biblical studies, one from Duke, one from Biola, and he's heading out in August to do his MPhil at Oxford and then his PhD out there as well in the defense of the scriptures. So Nabil is... where else would you see a Pakistani and an Indian sitting together in such delightful splendor, you know? And the Saudi guy, too.
Proof of the risen Lord, and we can be done now.
Right.
The first question is, you said that one reason for why you believe Jesus was who he said he was that you identify with his description of human intentions and feelings. How can making true claims within psychology make claims of the divine more believable?
Repeat that
I'll read it again. You said that one reason for why you believe Jesus was who he said he was that you could identify with his description of human intentions and feelings. How can making true claims within psychology make claims of the divine more believable?
How can the claims within psychology make the claims of divine believable?
I think the question is, how does Jesus' description of our condition help establish his divinity?
Okay. Well, I'll take that and give the boys the next ones, since you're directly questioning me. Psychology wouldn't call it sin. There's one massive distinction right off the bat. Psychology would give you a description of a horizontal sense, so there will be no vertical dimension to a creator whose law you have violated. Now let me explain why I think that is so critical. It is because the psychologist ultimately cannot forgive you. They can describe the malady, they can describe the disposition, they can describe what it is that you intended to do, wanted to do, but the I think it was Ingmar Bergman's play Wild Strawberries, I think, if I remember right, and you all know who he is. But in that play, a person goes to a court of law and he says to the judge, "What have I done?" And the judge says, "You're guilty." He says, "What am I guilty of?" He says, "You're guilty of guilt. You're guilty of guilt." And the person says to the judge, "Is that serious?" The judge says, "Very serious." Why? Where do you go if you're guilty of guilt? But if you're guilty of sin, you have a Savior. You have the one whose law has been violated and who has the right to forgive you. There's a world of a difference between the two, and you put the description of the human heart and give it that vertical dimension. See, this has ramifications far beyond psychology. It has ramifications for moral theory. When Richard Dawkins and the others talk about they can't believe in God because of all of the evil and wickedness in this world, I say to them, but when you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's a moral law by which to differentiate between good and evil. And if you assume there's a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. The question itself disappears. Now, you may stop me at one point and say, wait a minute, Why do I need a moral lawgiver? Why can't we have our cultural moral laws? The answer to that is very simple. Because every time you raise the question of evil, it is either raised by a person or about a person, which means you are assuming the person has intrinsic worth. That cannot be assumed by naturalism. That cannot be assumed by naturalism. That's why at one point Dawkins and the British Humanist Association actually toyed with the idea that maybe there's no real such thing as evil. And humanistic psychology, a la Hobart Maurer, who was a humanist, said in losing the notion of sin, we lost the definition of who we were. He saw the shortfall of humanistic psychology in not giving the vertical dimension of what was wrong with us. So the divine aspect is implicit in his diagnosis and in the reference to our intrinsic worth and the provision that ultimately forgiveness and grace is needed. That cannot be done by the psychological theory alone. A person may choose to forgive you, but there are errors of remission, commission, and if the sin is ultimately vertical, then only God is big enough to say to you and me, we are forgiven. So it's a confluence of the reality that naturalism and mere humanistic psychological theory, even Frankl would probably go the same route, talking about man's search for meaning and so on. So I'll leave you with that thought.
This question goes to Mr. Zacharias as well. Well, you said that all worldviews are exclusive in some way. But I was wondering, how is a worldview which in principle permits all views, as long as they can be proven, exclusive?
Last statement, how can the worldview what?
If there's a worldview which permits principally all views, all ideas, so long as they can be proven, how is this worldview exclusive?
Okay. If I'm false, since you've asked me, I'll answer that. That all worldviews claim to be exclusive. But if a worldview asks that they will believe something so long as it can be proven, how is this worldview exclusive? Is that your question? It's a very good question, and very fair. The area of proof is not exclusive to one particular worldview. It is part of almost any worldview because you assume that what you believe is true. And a person, you have a right to ask me, how do I know that Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be, and you want me to give you an argument or you want me to give you a proof. And then if you say, I'm a naturalist, I only believe in certain kinds of proof, it is fascinating. The man who coined the proof of empiricism was David Hume. Okay. He said, if a statement is not mathematical or tautological, cast it then into the flames. It is nothing but sophistry. So he was arguing for the empirical method of investigation, logical positivism, okay? If it is not mathematically so or necessarily so, cast it then into the flames. It is nothing but sophistry. The problem with David Hume's test for truth is that his own test for truth was neither mathematical nor tautological. So the statement itself did not meet his own test for what truth. It was not a mathematical statement. His statement was a metaphysical statement. So you're dealing now with the question of epistemology. How do you know something to be true? When you come to the scientific worldview, you apply the scientific method of empirical investigation. But it is always a tentative conclusion because something else can come in and change your conclusion. When you're talking about history, how do you verify history? You go to the documentation, proof is the word that is not used. The word is how do you demonstrate, how do you verify, how do you defend it? When you come to metaphysics, how do you prove the laws of logic? The laws of logic are considered to be self-evident because if a person denies the law of non-contradiction, he's actually affirming the law of non-contradiction while challenging the law of non-contradiction. So the test of truth is not exclusive to just one worldview. It is a proof where you demonstrate why your claim is exclusive or why your claim is true. It is not a worldview that says, I want proof. It is worldviews that are necessarily offering truth, in which case the counter-perspective demands proof or evidence. So I don't see that the naturalistic worldview is the only worldview that claims that wants proof. Religious worldview does too. If the question is, how do I know this is true? That is an epistemological question. So let me summarize it with this. When you're dealing with the Christian worldview that claims to be true, you're dealing with 5 areas of truth: theology, metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and anthropology. You bring all of these 5 together, and if you say to me, your worldview says, I demand proof, I would bring these 5 disciplines together and tell you, here is the evidence of why I believe the Christian faith is true. So it's not only your worldview that demands it, my worldview does too.
Yes. The question is just what proof can be permitted, right? You mentioned it yourself. It's the question, how do we know that something is true? And if we don't have an absolute answer to this question...
If we don't have?
An absolute answer to this question, in the sense that we would have an absolute true set of norms from which we can argue and find, well, an absolute answer to whether something is true or not true. If we don't have that, how can we even, try to make absolute claims? As, for instance, religion does. I mean...
Yeah. Fair enough. And I'll tell you one of the ways you do that. It's a great question. How can we make absolute claims when we can never be absolutely sure? All right? Are you absolutely sure that you need to know absolute truth?
Microphone doesn't work? Okay. I am not absolutely sure that I want to know whether absolute truth exists or not.
Okay, so that's a different question.
But I can say, even if I don't know, in the sense of relative truth we can have by adopting to some ways of arguing, I want to know. But then the question is, what can I allow? What proof can I allow to prove or disprove my theories, right?
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I let one of the other guys at this too, but here, let me say this to you. I think you're going about it the wrong way, and I'll tell you why. I remember being at the University of Florida, and the guy stood up and said, "How do I know that I exist?" He's a university student. And so I just looked at him and I said, let me quote for you what Professor Nathan at the University of New York said to a student when he asked him the question, "Professor Nathan, how do I know that I exist?" Professor Nathan said to him, "And who, shall I say, is asking?" See, even consciousness is not given to you by direct proof. The very fact of the 2 most important expressions you have just demonstrated, energy and consciousness, are evidenced by their results, not by the immediacy of what it is we claim. We don't see energy, we see the effects of it. So here's what I want to say to you. When you are investigating a worldview, you have to go to logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance, undeniability as a test of falsehood, unaffirmability as a test of truth. You have these 5. When you start off investigating a worldview, I'll tell you what is a surer way to do it than that. You start off by establishing if there is anything systemically false within that worldview. If there's something systemically false, then it implodes and caves in. You have to test it, and you test it by the coherence and correspondence. And if something is false within that worldview, you immediately have to be suspicious of whether the worldview itself is claiming to be true. And I'll have to let somebody else take the floor now, but here's what I say to you. If you could demonstrate for me that Jesus Christ never rose again from the dead, okay, suppose you could, I would have to revisit my whole worldview, not because I think you have proven your point, but you have asked me to demonstrate, you have demonstrated something that is systemically intrinsic, that is necessary for my worldview. And I believe that epistemology has a diversity of approaches, and anybody who denies that and thinks logical positivism is the only way makes the same mistake Stephen Hawking did, and the metaphysicians will take you to task for it. So the 5 tests I've given you is this. Now here's my closing thought for you. Is there an absolute? Yes. What is that absolute? If you're driving and you come to a traffic light and you stop, I'm assuming you do that here. In India, we just think it's Christmas and keep going. But you see a red light and you stop, okay? Now, your mind is wandering, and you look around and you see the car next to you, but you don't know if that car is moving or you're moving. What is your first thing you do? Go for your brake. If after you put your foot on the brake, you say to yourself, I don't know if I'm moving or he's moving, something is still moving. What is it you do is you look at something immovable, a tree or a lamppost or a building, and by that you judge whether you're moving or standing stationary. What would happen if the tree and the building started to move too? That is the whole world of relativism. So I say to you, an absolute is an unchanging point of reference, and for the Christian, that unchanging point of reference is God. Certainty comes from being meaningfully certain of what it is you're asserting. You cannot claim total objectivity in the semi-transcendent frame of mind. Neither you can claim that, nor can I claim that. So a meaningful certainty when the tests of truth are given to the assertions, that is the worldview to which I submit, and you will also have to submit. Stephen, Richard Dawkins this very week made the comment in an interview, it may be that evolution might prove to be wrong someday. But what did he say then? He said, well, maybe spores from another planet or something, started. He said, I don't know. But is he meaningfully certain right now that there's an earthbound explanation? Yes. Do I agree with him? No. Because I'm meaningfully certain that his arguments do not hold water. The earthbound theory of explanation doesn't satisfy it. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you. One of you guys can take the next one. Michael, do you want to add anything to that? No.
Okay. We'll ask actually another quick, maybe, text question. Can you, this would be for Nabil. Can you explain with logic and a rational way the concept of the Trinity?
Yes.
Great. Next question.
No, it's a very good question because it is so idiosyncratic to the Christian faith, and it is extremely important to understand. When I first wrestled with the Trinity, I found it to be very difficult. In fact, I was taught that the Trinity was veiled polytheism. Being raised in a Muslim home, especially with verses from the Quran like Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 73, it made it pretty clear to me that the Trinity is a belief in three gods, not one. And when I asked the average Christian to explain what the Trinity was, I usually didn't get anything more than a blank stare. And they would say, well, it's 3 in 1. And I'd say, well, what does that mean? You know, it's 3 in 1. It's like, well, that's a shampoo, not God. Tell me, what do you mean 3 in 1? And generally speaking, I wouldn't get a response. I'm going to cut to it so that we can have more questions. It's important to be able to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity if you believe in it. If you believe in it, be able to articulate it. Otherwise, you don't really know what you believe in, and you don't actually believe it. You want to believe it, but you don't know what it is. So be able to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is the belief that God is one in being and 3 in person. 1 in being and 3 in person. So right off the bat, it's not a contradiction. Because if I were to say it's 1 in being and 3 in being, that is a contradiction. It's 1 in being and 3 in person. So what's the difference between a being and a person? A being is that quality or that essence or that substance, whatever you want to call it. A being is that which makes you what you are. And a person is that quality or that essence that makes you whom you are. So a being is that which makes you what you are. A person is that which makes you whom you are. Now, what kind of a being am I? Thanks for the vote of confidence. I appreciate that. Human being. I'm a human being, just so you know. Now, who am I? I am Nabil Qureshi. So what I am is a human being. That's my being. Who I am is Nabil. That's my person. The two are not the same thing. All of us in here share essentially the same type of being that we are. We are human beings, but none of you share essentially the same kind of person that I am. We're all different persons. So the characteristic of a being is very different from that of a person. I am one being with one person. God is one being with 3 persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. Is there anything like that on this earth? No. But does that mean God cannot be one being in 3 persons? Absolutely. It means he can be that if that's what he is. There's no way we can know these deeper things about God apart from revelation. I do think that there is enough evidence in this world for us to conclude that God exists. I think it is the most rational conclusion. It's the most, it covers the most data, it makes the most sense, it fulfills, I think, the criterion of Occam's razor. I think it works. But how much can we know about God after that point? I think revelation is necessary to know the deeper things about God, and this is one of them, that God is 3 in 1. Tied in with this concept then of Trinity is also the idea of the persons of God. What does it mean for Jesus to be the Son of God? What does it mean for God the Father to be the Father? These are different roles in the Trinity, and oftentimes people see the term Son and then impute inferiority to the Son. In a sense, that's accurate to do. So let me put together some Bible verses for you, because especially when I debate Muslims or dialogue with them, these issues come to the fore, as they did with me when I was a Muslim. Some people will say that Jesus says things like in the Gospel of John, he says, the Father is greater than I. How is it possible that Jesus is God when he says, the Father is greater than I? And I would answer that question by saying, in our organization, Uncle Ravi Zacharias, he is the CEO of the organization. He is greater than I am. I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, he's at the top. And right now I'm earning brownie points. So he is greater than I am, but he is a human, just as I am. So his being is essentially equal to mine. He's a human being, I'm a human being, we're equal in that sense, but his role is greater than mine. And I'm inferior in that sense. So when Jesus says the Father is greater than I, the being is equal, the role is different. And this is how the Trinity all comes into focus when we start reading the Scripture. One last thing I want to close with is some people will say to me, but Nabil, the Trinity is not present in the Old Testament. This is something new that Christians came up with. I don't think so. I think when you start reading the Old Testament a bit more carefully, now through the lens of clarity that we have from the New Testament, you start seeing it in the Old Testament. And people might say, where? Where did we start seeing the Trinity in the Old Testament? I see it in the first verse of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, let's take that back into the Hebrew. It says, Elohim created. Elohim is the plural of God. It's gods. In the beginning, gods. But then the word created treats that word as if it's singular. In the beginning, gods created, as if it were singular. So right there at the very beginning of the Old Testament, you have plurality and singularity in the Godhead. You see it again in the very same chapter where it says, we. God refers to himself as we, plurally. How can God refer to himself plurally? And some people say, well, you know, the Queen of England does that. The plural of majesty was not used in Hebrew at that time. It was not convention. And then also when God says, we will create man in our image, male and female, we will make man. Male and female, in his image, and then it goes to plurality once again. Multiple times plurality in the Godhead. I'll end by saying this. In the Shema, this is the statement that Jews would often recite twice a day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Okay, very profound proclamation. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. In a world of polytheism, it's very profound. But that word one, echad, is not used to describe a singularity. It's used to describe something like a cluster of grapes. You would refer to the entire cluster as one cluster. That's what the word echad is. So even in the Shema, we have shades of the Trinity. It's just clarified through the person of Jesus, and it explains so much of what happens in the gospel. And I think, there's a lot more we could discuss here, but I think it's one of the most beautiful teachings about the depth of God's character and how he is unlike anything in this universe.
Great. I just want to read a statement and get your opinions on this. Science itself serves mainly as a tool to explain the world as we perceive it, using models and not truths or answers as is often misunderstood. So science does give us room to argue for the existence of God. However, today, the case that some Christians make is that God cannot be explained scientifically. And that is why maybe some scientists don't believe in God. What do you think about this?
You're saying that this is an explanation as to why some Christians think God can't be explained scientifically?
Yeah, or some people make the case that God cannot be explained scientifically, which might sort of put some scientists off of God. So what do you think? Can God be explained scientifically? Should he? I don't know.
Now, this is now where I think some definitions become very important, because we have to ask the question, what do we mean and what qualifies as a scientific explanation of something? Now, classically, there are three levels of explanation. Causal explanation. If I took Dr. Zacharias' notebook and threw it at you, okay, I'm the cause of the motion of the book flying to you. Then, outside of the causal, we also have, if you like, our capacity to create a model, a form of equation that will describe the flight path that the book will take. And using mathematics I was taught when I was 8 years old, if I know the angle of departure from my hand and the velocity with which it left, I can predict with 100% certainty every single time where it will land. Okay, it will take a beautiful parabolic curve and fly. The third level of explanation is to do with teleology, or why. Now, science as a discipline made the decision for some very good reasons a while ago. It would not deal with intentional or why explanations of anything. Make sense? It would limit its discipline to the first two. Now, having limited itself to those first two as for its discipline, it's one thing to say we as a group of scientists will not ask the question why. It's another thing to conclude that there is no answer to the question why. So I think it rather depends now what we mean, therefore, by science. because it's that third category of intentionality and asking the ultimate question, why, that some scientists feel if they're atheists is illegitimate, we shouldn't go there, there are no answers to that question, it's not science, and therefore whenever Christians talk about God doing something, that's a personal explanation, it doesn't count, it's not capable of being counted as science by definition, and other people will say, but wait a minute, if God is actually the cause of this, then surely that satisfies the first requirement, and what's often happening is there's a confusion about it. So I'm not sure exactly how to respond best to the statement, apart from maybe to give an illustration that a friend of mine who heads up postgraduate theoretical physics at the University of Oxford gives when people ask him why he's a believer in Jesus Christ and also a theoretical physicist. In Oxford, we drink a lot of tea. You may be aware of this fact. It was what makes us so interesting as an English race, the tea drinking. And let's supposing you walk into this Oxford Don study and you see the kettle boiling. And you say, well, why is the kettle boiling? And the response is, well, there's a heat source. And its energy is being transferred through a metal base, which is a conductor of electricity, into the liquid contained within the kettle. Now, as the energy transfers over this surface, the molecules within the liquid are absorbing more energy and becoming increasingly agitated. And eventually, the increase in the amount of energy will mean it will move from being a liquid state into a gaseous state, and that's why it's boiling. Now, that's one level of explanation. Or he could say, I want a cup of tea. Now, the question is, are these two explanations in conflict with each other? Does the existence of the scientific explanation I gave you in explanation number 1 discount or disprove the second explanation? And the answer is no. Let's ask a philosophical question. Is the first explanation philosophically capable of disproving the second? No. To do so, and to claim so, would be to do what's called a category error. Category error is where you falsely argue from one philosophical category into another, and here we have a category error of law and agency. A colleague of mine, by the name of Professor John Lennox, he sometimes gives another illustration. I'll just end with this. Let's supposing I produced a car in front of you. Now, I've loved cars since the age of 4. By the age of 5, I knew the price of every car for sale, how fast it went, its power, and everything else. And I've been interested in cars ever since. So we produce a car, and I ask you how to explain the presence of the engine and it works. And one explanation is, well, we've got these laws of energy and mass and motion, and it's being transferred from one form of energy, it's being transferred into another type, and I can explain it through my science. And if we have a very simple car, like a Model T Ford, one of the first production cars ever made, there's nothing mysterious about it, and actually, even someone who has as bad mechanical knowledge as me can look underneath the bonnet and figure out what may be happening there. The second explanation would be, Mr. Ford built it. And then I ask you to choose between the two explanations. Which of these is the best answer? And the answer is, well, we're not forced to choose. Logic doesn't force us to choose. So it doesn't matter how much scientific knowledge we gain. If I could give you a perfect mathematical model for the operation of this universe and there was nothing mysterious in it, is that capable of disproving a mind behind it? And the answer is, it's not even capable of doing it. So if you're a Christian here and for some reason you feel nervous about the discipline of science, my urging to you would be, study science, embrace it, run to it. Of course, study it. There's no problem. If you are in the discipline of science, maybe take some thought to think about what science does do and what science doesn't do. There's a very old book by a Professor Medawar, M-E-D-A-W-A-R, used to be a professor at Oxford, published a very famous book called The Limits of Science, which interestingly, when I saw Lennox and Richard Dawkins debate each other, they both agreed was an excellent book. And I would suggest that as recommended reading for anyone who's interested in the discipline, to try to answer the question, what questions does science answer, and what questions isn't it answering? And let's just not confuse the fact that by the fact it doesn't attempt to answer some questions, doesn't mean necessarily that there isn't one. I hope that's an okay answer to your question.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's a good point at which to also add a footnote to the gentleman that raised that great question, so that I didn't miss the front-end loaded question with you, which struck me after I sat down. What about the worldview, what is exclusive about a worldview that wants proof? That was the gist of the first part of the question, you know, that says, I want proof. How did you word that? Yeah, please, yeah. How did you word that question?
The original question was how a worldview which basically permits all different kinds of ideas of views and only wants that these ideas are proven, how this worldview is exclusive.
That admits all worldviews?
That in principle would allow any idea as long as it is proven.
That the way that is exclusive is it would exclude those who said you don't need proof. So that's when it becomes exclusive.
Would you mind giving a definition of proof?
No, see, that's what we went into. No, I won't go into that, because I think proof, you're talking about scientific proof. And the other thing, I think it is important that I also leave with you, because your question is a great one. It's a very important one. I think Michael also addressed that implicitly. The question you are raising is not a worldview question. It's a methodological question.
Yes.
So that's it.
Okay.
It is dealing with not a system of thought, it's dealing with the methodological way of how you know something to be true. So that's not a worldview. That's not a worldview. It's a methodology. So when you're dealing with a ontology, what is reality, and then you deal with epistemology, what is a method, I think it's the same thing that's happening here with the categories are being crossed. And so I don't take up time from the next questioner. That's what I want to say to you. Two things: that it excludes worldviews that say, I don't need proof. So it's exclusive in that sense. And number two, it is a methodological question, not a question of content within a worldview. How do I know something is true? And that's epistemology. That's really not ontology. What is ontology. How you know what is epistemology and methodology. And I think that's where some of this confusing, maybe it'll be great if we could sit across a table, you know. I tell you what, you invite us back. I saw you at a restaurant last night and you saw me there. I like that restaurant. So sometime we come back, sit around, because I like the questions you're raising. They're good questions. And I think if we don't, I was reminded of what Michael's point was. Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, in the last paragraph, made this comment: I have now told you what. If I could tell you why, I would have the mind of God. So there's a content and there's a method. And I hope you and I can stay connected some way. And I think it'll be tremendous to keep a dialogue going. We can do that. I spend a lot of time in the air, and we can do it. Blessings on you. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Ravi Zacharias. My question is from the topic yesterday on secularization, its power and its control. I just want like a personal application to say, you talked about secularization, loss of shame, pluralism, loss of reason, and privatization, no meaning.
Loss of meaning.
Yeah. Where and how do you draw the line, given this kind of problem? Where and how do you draw that line? Then, with respect to why I am a Christian, how does one explain? Because what's very interesting for me is the transformation and the afterlife when you become a Christian, like explained by Michael. I want to know, how do you explain, like in Africa, where you have so much religious belief and less transformation?
Shall I take? Okay, let me just take the second part of the question first, because we can maybe deal with that faster. I've been to Africa many times, and it's a wonderful continent. And if it were possible to solve all the issues of corruption right across the African continent, it would maybe well be one of the richest continents in the whole world. There are a lot of people even in Africa, who claim to be Christian. And one of the challenges is, what do you do with people who claim to have a transformed life, but their life isn't transformed? That's a problem. One of the earliest books in the Bible is the book of Galatians. The writer of that letter, the Apostle Paul, has some big questions in that book. One is, what is the real gospel as opposed to the false gospel? That's one of his questions, and it's a very big question. His second question is, what is a real Christian as opposed to someone who claims they're a Christian but not? Now, with regard to what you're asking, there are many people in this world who claim Christianity, or maybe use it as a title. But just because you claim the title doesn't necessarily mean you are. So the Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, says, listen, there's a fruit in the spirit of the life of a Christian. One fruit. He uses a singular word. And the fruit, he says, when you taste it, should taste of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and so on. He makes this list. So what the Apostle Paul is saying to the people around him, he's saying, bite me. Okay? But he's saying it in a very nice way. What he's saying is, look, if someone claims to be a Christian and that their life has been changed, taste the fruit of their life. Test it. Don't believe them just because they claim it. Ask, is the evidence there? And then he says, if the evidence isn't there, what you taste is murder, lust, envy, malice, then even though they're claiming something, it's not true. Reject it. Now, this is one of the problems that we have, not just in Africa, but right across the world. Is Christianity a label, a cultural label, that describes an attitude or a country of birth or something like that? Or is it encountering the person of Christ and having your whole life changed? If it's just a cultural label, then sure, many things can be Christian. But if Christian literally means little Christ, and it was in Antioch that Christians were first called Christians, it literally means you look like Christ. You're like a smaller version of him. If it means encountering and being changed by him so you're like him, you should be able to see that in the lives of the people around you. Because you raised it within the context of Africa, there was an amazing editorial written by one of Britain's leading atheists. His name is Matthew Paris, and he wrote an article in the Times newspaper just before Christmas, several years ago. I remember reading the paper thinking, this is incredible. And if you Google it, look for it. His surname is Paris, P-A-R-I-S, like the city. And the article was called Africa Needs God. And the general gist of his article is this. He said, look, I volunteer for the UN. I help the UN campaign for clean water projects in Africa. He says, when you go to Africa like I do, he said, you meet a lot of Christian missionaries there who are also providing clean water. And what I would normally say to them as an atheist is, look, just give them the clean water. Drop God. They don't need God. They don't need Jesus. What they need is clean water. Why can't you Christian missionaries go to Africa and just give them the clean water and leave religion out of it? It's better. And then he says, it is hard for me to write this. And even as I write it, I'm struggling to believe I'm saying it, but Africa needs God. He said, as I travel around and meet those people who have encountered the person of Christ, their hearts are changed. Their lives are different. You can see it in their eyes, and you can see it in how they live their life. Now, I find that fascinating coming from the pen of such a well-known atheist in England. So, on the other side to the question about, just because you related a question asked, read that article. I would encourage anyone here, just Google it. You'll find it on the Times newspaper website, the article. Matthew Paris I find him a fascinating atheist. I read almost everything he writes because he says so much that I agree with, and he also says it so well. And see if that is helpful.
The article that Michael is referring to by Paris, a renowned atheist, and the article he begins by saying, I'm shocked at what I'm going to say. I cannot believe I'm saying this as a confirmed atheist. It's a long article. I'll give you the notation. He ends the article by saying, those who want Africa to walk tall amid 21st century global competition must not kid themselves that providing the material means or even the know-how that accompanies what we call development will make the change. A whole belief system must first be supplanted. And I'm afraid, here's what Paris is saying, it has to be supplanted by another, removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. It's Paris. Now, the notation for that is, I think it was in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, it was a few years ago. Yes, December 27, 2008, in the Times. And it's called, As an Atheist, I Truly Believe Africa Needs God. That's the article he's referring to. To go to the first part of your question, where do we draw the line in secularization, pluralization, privatization? I'm not sure I'm getting to the heart of what you're driving at. But how does it work out in culture? It works out this way. There are three ways in which cultures function. Social theorists with the God idea will tell you. There is a theonomous culture. Theos is the word for God, nomos is the word for law, where they believe in some cultures, the mind of God is known within the conscience of humanity. We used to call that natural law. I don't know if there's any country that comes close to a theonomous culture, but maybe India does. India, they refer to themselves as dharti ke aadmi, people of the soil. But there's a sense in which respect for elders, traditions, ceremony, and all they say is in the conscience. It's in the heart. That's a theonomous culture. There's a second kind of culture which is called a heteronomous culture. Heteros meaning other, nomos meaning law, another law. What does that mean? Where a handful at the top dictate for the masses below. In religious terms, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they are heteronomous cultures, where the handful at the top control the belief and the practice of the masses. You really don't have the freedom to disbelieve. In irreligious terms, China is a heteronomous culture, where a handful at the top control it for the masses below. For the most part in the West, we would not see ourselves as theonomous or heteronomous. We would see the culture as autonomous. Autos, self, nomos, law, where we individually determine for ourselves which path or which belief or which moral theory we are going to be able to subscribe to. The difficulty with that is the framing ideas of a culture have to be pre-subscribed to first. And a cultural revolution is underway when you reject the shared meanings of the past. And in pluralization today, when I went to Canada in 1966, there were 500 Indians in Toronto. Which means if you saw another Indian, you'd cross the road and say, how are you doing? Let's go and have a cup of tea or something like that. Today, there are 500,000 Indians in Toronto. If I said hello to every Indian in Toronto, I wouldn't get anywhere. You're going to bump into them all over the place. The whole city, the whole ethos has changed. Now, when there's an infusion of a different culture and a different version of belief, where are the shared meanings of the past? There are no longer shared meanings of the past. There's a mix that has to come in. Let me give you one illustration from America, then I'll sit down. It's this. We believe these truths to be self-evident, that we're all created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Okay? The Declaration of Independence. No worldview other than the Judeo-Christian worldview would have made that statement. These truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Now, that was the original belief system, which is no longer there. That's why natural law has gone, and autonomy now means what can politically be enforced, where today the institution that is least trusted in the West and the East as well is politics. But that's where we place our trust in ethics. We call it politically correct. The very institution we distrust is the institution we entrust our ethics with in the end. It's very difficult to draw the line when there's not a prior commitment to a worldview and a value system. That's why our world is in absolute chaos today. There is no prior commitment or shared meanings of the past. Your question is a great one and has to be pursued by social theorists. And I would just say to it, you remove God from the paradigm, and Chesterton said, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it's much worse. You may end up believing in anything. That's where we are. Thank you. You take the last one for him.
Thank you. First of all, I would just want to say thank you so much for your ministry. It's meant a lot to me, for me personally. It's been 1 year since I first met Christ, so I'm nervous just standing here and saying this. My question is quite simple, and it goes out to any one of you. It would be nice if Ravi answered it, maybe just because I'm a little bit starstruck or something. Yeah. What's your best advice for a person who has just started their walk with the Lord?
Who's just starting their walk with the Lord?
Yes.
You know what? I would be honored to answer your question, but I'd like to give my friend here the opportunity because he's a younger Christian, and then I'd like to close with a closing statement. Yes. But thank you. I think you'll get excellent advice from Nabil. We talk about these things a lot. In fact, we spent 2 hours yesterday around lunch talking about things like that, so Nabil will help you with that.
I think it's interesting that all the questions tonight were pretty exclusivist, directed at him. I feel left out. No, that's perfectly fine. I would be asking him the question too. I mean, he's the legend. So whatever I'll say, he'll fix it when I sit down. I think as a new Christian, I remember back to when I was a new Christian, I had no idea what I was doing, like no idea. My friend who had shared Christianity and the gospel with me, he had to go to New York as soon as I accepted Christ. That was August 24th of 2005. He left because his PhD program was starting in New York. And so I didn't know what I was doing. I met some other Christians who had just become Christian too. There was a Buddhist who had just become a Christian, and there were two guys who had kind of been cultural Christians their whole lives, but they didn't really walk with Christ, and so they were deciding, that fruit that he was talking about wasn't there. So the four of us got together, and we said, how are we going to do this? And we said, well, we want to follow Jesus, so we want to be like Christ. And he said, how are we going to do that? I said, well, let's go to a Christian bookstore and see if there's a book that teaches us how to be like Christ. So we go to a Christian bookstore, and we see a book on the shelf said, so, you want to be like Christ? Yes. So we picked up the book, and we just started reading through it. It was by a man named Chuck Swindoll. And so we read the book together. Every Wednesday, we'd get together, we'd read the book together, we'd talk about it, and we'd do what it said. So it said the first chapter, I believe, was on simplicity. It was how to introduce simplicity into your life. The next chapter, I think, was on silence, how to be quiet before God and to take all the noise out of your life. And so we were just doing what it said. And then we read the Bible, and those are the two things we did. Read that and read the Bible, and we just kept doing what it was teaching us. We were embracing these teachings. After a while, we saw some amazing things, and I know in a secular environment, it might be hard to kind of grasp these things, and it might sound like I'm crazy when I say this, but we saw prophecies being given, we saw an exorcism, we saw all kinds of things that were of the supernatural flavor that I would have never believed in had I not seen them myself. I'm a rather skeptical kind of guy, in fact. That's why it took me 4 years to accept the evidence for Christianity. So all these things are happening, and I'm memorizing the scripture too, because as a Muslim, I had been taught to learn parts of the Quran. By the age of 5, I had the last 7 chapters of the Quran memorized. And so I was zealous about memorizing the Quran from a young age, and so I was memorizing the book of Ephesians as a new believer, and I was just trying to do everything I possibly could. When I got to church, I finally started going to a church, I realized nobody else was really that passionate about being like Christ. And slowly my enthusiasm wore off. I pretty much I stopped memorizing. After I memorized Ephesians, I never memorized anything else. And all this time spent in trying to be like Christ, that kind of went by the wayside, and I started engaging myself in life again. And that magical moment of being an early Christian, walking with Christ and really just throwing myself onto his person, that was gone because it wore off. So my advice to you is not don't go to church. Go to church. It's important. But my advice to you is make sure you maintain a passionate pursuit of Jesus. There's so much that can kind of cloud your view as a Christian. What do Christians believe about this? How do Christians go about that? What do Christians believe historically about this? Blah, 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 blah. That stuff can be important, but Jesus, keep him front and center. Learn more about him. Learn how he would respond to a certain situation. Learn how grace would be shown through him. And when you think through that lens, then you become more and more like him. And that's what the meaning is to be a Christian. The word Christian implies that you are a little Christ Christian. And so many people I know call themselves Christian but never display the grace of Christ. They call themselves a follower of Jesus but would never be self-sacrificial the way Jesus was self-sacrificial and taught us to be self-sacrificial. So keep your eyes set on Jesus, passionately pursue him, be ready to be a fool for God, because I'm telling you, as that transforms you as a person, you will become a light in a dark place. And don't get distracted by Christianity. That will come if you keep your eyes set on the center, on Jesus. That's the greatest advice I could give you.
Thank you.
That answer should sum it up for you, the key elements in that. Build your friendships with those with whom you can be transparent, vulnerable, honest, candid, stumbling, slipping, falling. You've got those friends to talk to. Find a mentor who will work with you and draw the best out of you and not change your personality, but take the strength God has poured into you and maximize it to your potential. Find a mentor. Read well in a diversity of areas, from the devotional to the rigorously philosophical. The devotional will come here, the philosophical will come there, and you balance it. Discipline your prayer life. Don't let your prayer life be invaded by the common distractions of every day. Start your day in prayer, just opening your heart before the Lord. I always read one particular author who's my favorite before I even pray, because I don't like to waste my time in slumber while I'm praying. I allow this guy to wake me up. Then we do that. In the friendships that you have, don't play games. If you're struggling, admit it. If you're faltering, admit it. The best thing you can have is friends who put their arms around you and not judge you. But it's not that you will never stumble, but don't ever stay on the ground. Somebody needs to be there to lift you up and help you keep walking. I know many people who say they never go to church because they end up feeling worse at the end of it. They're hammered so hard sometimes. And that's unfortunate. Not every church is like that, but sometimes it can be where you're already down and boom, comes another blow to your head. Find places where there's a balance. Reprimand is a good thing, but never end with that, let it lift you up. I've traveled so much in my life that my companions have been my books. I don't mean the books I'm writing, but the books I'm reading. You have to be able to read. And that's when, an expenditure of words without an income of ideas will lead to conceptual bankruptcy. An expenditure of words without an income of ideas will lead to conceptual bankruptcy. Take in. That's when you start giving out. And I say to you, thank God for young men like you. You've got the courage. Live in such a way that you will draw lines that you will not cross. There's a talk I've given on Daniel called Marching to a Different Drummer. If you go on our website, it gives you, learn how to define pleasure, things like this. But I commend you for beginning your walk. I'm going to close with this, and to the gentleman there, I'm going to give you my email. I don't do this in public ever, but I'll give it to you. Let's pick up a correspondence, because I think your questions are right on target. They're obviously trying to unpack why this, not that, and whatever your views are on Christianity, I don't know, but I think your questions are great. And I promise that sometimes it'll take a while for me to get back to you, but I promise I will get back to you as I'm traveling along, whatever those questions. And we have a team that might say, all I'd ask you to do is introduce yourself when you write and remind us of our conversation here. Then I'll be able to put a picture to the name as well. For those of you who don't know Christ, I'd like to close with this. When I was a younger man listening to music, there was a group called Kingston Trio, and it is a song called Desert Pete. It talks about a man going through the desert and would use up all of his bottles of water and would begin to get parched with thirst. He would see a pump in the middle, and he lunged towards the pump, but when he lifted the arm and brought it down, dry, metal upon metal, no water. He was about to despair, but he saw a tin can around it, and inside the tin can a message. And in that message it said, "Dear parser, traveler by, don't despair, there's enough water here, just follow the instructions. Under the nozzle, where you see the sand, there'll be a bottle of water. It should be full. Take it out, don't drink it. Empty it out into the pump as instructed. Prime with the other hand, the system will begin to work and it'll draw the water out from underneath. Water will come gushing out. Drink all you want, refill all the bottles you've got. Don't forget to fill up that one bottle and put it back for the next person passing by. Warning, if you consume the one bottle, you will soon be thirsty again. Empty it out as instructed. You will have all the water you want for your journey." Signed, Desert Pete. Andrew Fletcher, I think, was a political activist in Scotland who said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." What he meant was music often will tell a story far more real from here. You come to the person of Christ, you have a choice. You can reject him and spend your life upon yourself. Christ says you will soon be thirsty and empty again. Empty your life out into his hands, and he gives you the bread of life, the water of life, the purpose for which you were created. You're tempted to take that one life and spend it on yourself. He says, don't do it. You will soon be empty. Empty your life out into the hands of Christ, and he will give you that living water and that bread of life. So take the Gospel of John, read it with an honest heart, and say, "Jesus, if you're who you claim to be, speak to me." I want to close with a word of thanks to you at this university. You know, we do scores of universities. What is the best way in a pluralistic society to find answers? It's like this. We get together, we don't have to agree, we dialogue, we defend, we present. When universities block this out, then it's a highly prejudicial thing towards hundreds of millions of people for whom this belief is sacred. So in the public square, we ought to be able to do this peaceably, in a civil way. And if we disagree, we disagree. But truth will win out in the end. And your motto actually is right. It was Andrei Sakharov quoting Natan Sharansky, quoting Andrei Sakharov, the physicist, who said, "I used to think that the bomb was the most powerful weapon in the world. It is not." He said, "The truth is the most powerful weapon in the world." And Winston Churchill said, "Truth is the most valuable thing in the world, so valuable that often it is hidden by a bodyguard of lies." There's a lot of lies out there. Put the test of truth, look for the demonstration, look for the evidence, and find that coherent worldview. And when Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes unto the Father except by me," I believe he demonstrated it. And the best proof will be when you trust him and walk with him and find that he honors his word that he has given to you. We are honored to be with you, and thank you for all the organization and your staff. God bless you. I hope we'll see you again. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Zacharias. Thank you, Michael and Nabil. I think I can say for all of us, this evening has ended too quickly. I can feel in the air that there are still more questions. I know that on my phone there are still more questions. I will be brave and actually venture an idea that if you have sent a text message, that is my number. This is what I do. I may not be as wise as these men, but my search is for the truth as well. And I long to dialogue. Credo and agape long to dialogue. For you, sir, who just became a believer, seek out one of these student groups, because this is our desire, that we would grow in relationship to Jesus Christ, not because it is a worldview, but because it is a person who makes a difference and changes the world. Period. And that is why we exist. Please take the time and fill out the response cards. We would love to hear from you. Drop them off. Talk to the students who are in the back. Thank you so much for coming, and may God bless you.